Obviously, the biggest question is when it will finish. Of course, we mean by this the Russian war in Ukraine, but beside that, we understand that there is a broader context in it. And obviously, the world is now in crisis or in the beginning of crisis. So, what do you think? Whether it is possible to use this model of cycles in geopolitics, because typically there are communists who are using that. And if yes, then when we are now, because communist economists typically are talking about crisis moment, about recovery, and then about sustainable development, and in fact, growth, and then again crisis, and so on. So if we consider this kind of model, then geopolitics and where is the world now? Thank you. That is a great opportunity to discuss something else but the war, because the war takes all our time and all our opportunities and all our capabilities, mental capabilities. Let's hope that in this way we will be able to think about geopolitical situation. But just to start the discussion, I'd like to say that quite often we over-exaggerate and we think that Ukrainian crisis as the interest is of the great interest for everyone. First of all, we should not fool ourselves, because we are not the key player, and probably our listeners and viewers, for them to understand, it's important to understand that when you become kind of sad European country, for most of the countries is the way for survival, not to be on the front lines of tragedy and sacrifices we're going through. But we were unlucky, and our nations, due to different reasons, we were unlucky, and nevertheless we are interesting for many nations, including such aggressive nation as the Russians. And what we are observing is the consequence of many different reasons. Some of them are geopolitical. These reasons are also that is the key problem. But nevertheless, the key problem isn't the Russian Federation. If we consider what did we become the beginning of the crisis, well, I think that we are in not the beginning of the crisis, because of course the country which became which gave the birth to this crisis is outside of the future negotiations, and historically this country is not benefiting for its cultural development. Both of us worked in the US, and in fact, the U.S. Is still the hegemon in the world, and the U.S. is going through a very difficult period of time. And I observed it during 2009-2012, and I made a conclusion, which is not scientific, because I do not think that it's exhausting. But at that moment, there was a significant difference between the elites, American elites, which became more liberal, different types liberals, human rights, genderism, and other types, and all these kind of rural life of rural areas in the U.S. In our opinion, that was, so to say, a tough Republican federation of the RNA, those who appreciated the opportunity to have the weapon, and there are the people who consider the rifle in their hands to be something that gives them the rights. And I thought that there will be the kind of contradiction between these two political sides. The partially black president was already problematic. And as you remember, the State Secretary Clinton was suggested to be a president. At that point, I thought that for many in the U.S., in the kind of conservative society, it will not be well perceived. And the U.S. is not the entire world, but a lot of things depend on them, and therefore we have to expect very interesting times. So of course, I do not think that the cycles are exactly the same, but it works more kind of spiral. So when it's expanding, you can see the similar things happening. So in my opinion, Ukraine is in the situation which was which happened after the colonial wars, so the First World War, when most of the empires ceased existing, and that became not irrelevant for those economic development, technology development, and society development. So, in my opinion, a post-industrial development and mostly the social networks brought each person to the level when people think that they are making the decisions in political world, they have their position, they have their opinion, and they expect the actions. And that is the stage we are in now. And in this case, I dare to compare it with pure sugar, which we received through technologies. And we, as humanity, we are humanity, but we did not achieve these. So sugar continues deteriorating our image, and we cannot adjust. Social networks and participation in political life of extremely big groups of people, that is where we are now. The next steps, all of them, they are going to go together with these key problems. So as far as I understand, not economical cycles, but the other issues more important for geopolitics. So economy is not the key here. You're right. And the only thing is continuing your thought about the US, I think that the US were not the first in this kind of populism, at least when we were trying to show that processes in Ukraine are very democratic. We have the new president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who has, so to say, doesn't have any kind of affiliation with the state officials or have never obtained the official position. And when I was trying to, so to say, sell it as a positive aspect of this president, I was told that I'm not the first in this line, because ambassadors from the other countries said that we have a mayor actor, and in Italy there was a populistic actor. And that is a kind of bacilla of easy decisions, and this virus of simple decisions has already infected many countries. But in the US, we indeed have some special nuances, which are quite difficult to understand if you do not understand these dynamics of the last decade development of the state. And therefore, even the first presidency of Donald Trump was not, so to say, unexpected, even though it was quite close to being, the chances were almost equal. But nevertheless, the second time was already the continuation of the same line. And in this case, we have the question. So if it is US, which is far from Europe, where the war is ongoing. Now we have the most horrible war with the hugest consequences in the recent history, the Russian war in Ukraine. Many people said that the world is now in the crisis belt, also when it comes to the conflict countries, and that will be the period of wars. But it was said that these wars can happen neither in Middle East nor in Africa, where we have the war in Sudan. By the way, we do not know much about what is going on there, or what is also mentioned nowadays as somewhere in the Pacific area. So there is the tension between Pakistan, India, the RCP. So are these kind of scenarios, do you consider this kind of scenario, if you agree that wars can be happening the next 20, 30 years, so do you think that the epicenter will move from Europe to the other parts of the world? Well, I think that I would mention that quite a lot. Europe is losing leadership. Europe is kind of ideological leader, but nevertheless, it doesn't play any economical significant role. They do not create the new census. I do not want to say that the European page is closed, but Europe is not anymore the producer of ideological even content. So they are not spreading the new religion. They do not have the new renaissance. And it's hard to name any kind of cultural products except for Eurovision, which are consumed all around the world. And the tendency, well, my friend recently reminded me that traditional Olympic sports, among traditional Olympic sports, so there is only one Asian. Judo is the only one. But nevertheless, the number of people who we consider the Eastern Oriental civilization, it is unproportionately small comparing to the contribution which was made in athletics, having only one and representing all Asia. One sport was representing the entire Asia. So this project is over. So I got once a very important lesson. We were with our diplomats at the table, and we were discussing Ukrainian tragedy and how unexpected it was for Europe and how we were fighting for all of this. And that was the ambassador of one of the friendly Arabian countries. And he took a word and he said, you know, how I'm tired of you with all your talks about Ukraine. You do not notice the rest of the tragedies happening around the world. And I can tell you why, because that is a war of white people. And everyone was silent, and there were two representatives of American diplomatic corps, and they were black, and they understood that it's not about their color, but about our civilization, because we still think that we have some significant role, and we are exaggerating the tragedy which is happening in Ukraine. And we believe that, considering the fact that we play such a significant role, everyone has to pay attention to it. And that is a key problem which we do not understand when we are communicating it to the US. So we do not understand that they are losing the interest to us, that they do not care, that they are not interested. And when we are producing our new position, we are still considering our interests and not theirs. And that is a problem which we did not manage so far. And this current populism which exists in info landscape and our approach with simple decisions, it can lead us to the deadline. We still did it, but the collapse of these kind of stories will happen. So you are closer to the yes. Well, yes, because I do agree with you that we do not forget about our problems, but unfortunately the key to resolving our problems is still in Washington, even though, as we understand, this key is better to have in our hands, or at least in the hands of our European partners, and to keep our hand on this key. Well, I think that 95% of Ukrainians shares your opinion. I can say, the only thing I can say is that that is correct, but probably that is not the full version. So maybe if it is the key to stop Putin, and if it lies there, then the lock is still in Moscow. And I hope that the axe is in Kyiv. So the subjectivity of Ukraine exists as subject when the war isn't going. And the key decisions are made in Ukraine by those who are at war, by those who help the front lines. And this message is important for both Trump and Putin, because they think that hierarchy or autocracy allows the president or the head of the Russian Federation to resolve all the problems. And Ukraine has never made these decisions, the decisions in this way. One person, even the group of people, even when they made the decisions, then people were saying their word. And by the way, that is something we have in our constitution and in the constitution of the US. Yes, the only problem we have is that we have to understand that we can die as nation. and being brave, and our task is to explain to the Americans that we have not only just the red line, we quote that there are lots of red lines. At the moment, we are trying to play, so to say, explanations, explaining what, in our opinion, is not worth explaining, because it's obvious who attacked whom. And why do we need these explanations? Why do we have all these kind of arguments? It's, as a diplomat, I feel so sorry for when I see these kind of things, because it's the way to nowhere. And some people consider diplomacy as a kind of giving up, but gradually, because diplomacy is an open discussion to explaining that these kind of lines do not work. One of the line means that we are not going to recognize these territories, and exchange is impossible, and everything has to be behind this line. In this case, it will be easier because we'll clean the field. It will be painful. Probably there will be a scandal, but nevertheless, we have to foresee that and to develop our strategies considering the risk we have. For example, what will happen if we now, and that is going to happen just in a few weeks. And I'm very sorry we were talking about geopolitical issues, but once again, we are talking about the U.S. If we will have no assistance, in this case, our attempts to be friends with India or opening new embassies in Africa will not happen. Now is the time for the radical actions, which will have the direct impact. For 3 years, we have the ongoing full-scale war. It's not just painful, but also the balance between the readiness of the nation to go to war and the Trump's decisions is ruined. Well, I think that we have big challenges. We are in a very difficult situation. The only thing, if we didn't have these changes. We have the new statements comparing to the peace treaty, more realistic statements, but we have to explain that because we do not that be perceived in the way how they see the shift of the. But for some reason, they are dividing something in parts, the parts of Ukraine, and that can be a kind of temporary occupied territories, but it cannot be documented somewhere in the constitution. We know the risks, and that can be not recognition by Ukraine. I do not believe that someone in Ukraine will agree on that. And according to Ukrainian legislation, that is betraying Ukraine. But just agreement that it's kind of occupation for some period of time, well, in fact, that is something that we hear now. And therefore, what do you think about it? So, yes, you've said that I do agree that indeed everyone understands everything. And when people are sticking to sides, to quotes, that someone doesn't understand something, that Donald Trump doesn't understand something, well, everyone understands everything. So speaking of the tools, of the instruments, do we need to look for the ways to promote our own narratives, our own messages? Well, we see that lots of meetings are organized lots of meetings, and lots of the members of the delegations are from the Russian side, with the head of the state and with the members of the delegation, and we are told that there is some kind of private discussions on the level of the one person in Ukraine, and Yermak, and the second one is the president, who is official. Are these tools correct? Because there are other ways to do it the other way around, and maybe these kind of things have to be done through not public ways. How do you consider these tools? And then where are our institutional mechanism of interaction between the U.S. and Ukraine? We have the Commission of the Strategic Cooperation, the Trade Commission, Energy, and we have lots of ways to deliver the message, and even to the members of the delegation. The meetings of the ministers of the foreign affairs of Ukraine and the state state secretary happening in fields. Well, how these tools work, what would you have recommended? What we could have added? Well, recently I have an interesting discussion with the people who care of it in the framework of the Club of Reforms, similar to the British Club of Reforms. And it was interesting for me to hear about the mechanisms, the formal of security guarantees, because all of us are talking about some theoretical guarantees we have to be provided with, and each of these guarantees are speaking about the future attack, and no one explains us how shall we work today. And each time I'm asking, okay, explain me, please, how your next parliament will be ready to allocate funds which is not ready now. And the prime minister will vote for redirecting the troops the next time. But we will have more weapons in our warehouses the next time. Everything is the next time. So in fact, we are agreeing with these, and we are fooling ourselves. But speaking of the availability of the other channels, so it's quite obvious that we have nothing to be discussing. And it's not only just the fault of our leadership, it's not the fault of our nation, which in fact gave all the rights and the responsibility to all the people without responsibility and rights for the others. I'm not talking about opposition. For example, in the UK, as you know, the government is called the government of Her Majesty and the position of Her Majesty. So that is the position of the king and the royal family. So these people are elected by the nation, but they can vote for these or for the others, but all of them are representatives of the nation. The second thing, and the third thing, which is disturbing me the most, is that are our the partners who quite often consider their role and the way how our state works. They prefer talking to one or two people instead of supporting the preach practice. So the way how they were explaining us everything should be working, that there are institutions, that there are ministries, there is civil society, there are expert circles, there is media circles, which have the right and have to do something. The thing which is happening right now, that is, so to say, exception and not the rule. And we probably not all of us understand, but when the Minsk process was in place, and now it's better not to be talking about it anymore. Even at that time, we had so many levels and channels for communication, and sometimes they were called third, fourth track, and not all of them were public. Not everyone knew about them, but nevertheless, it allowed us sometimes to communicate with those people who quite obviously can be our ideological enemies. But it's impossible to do it the other way, and not because we just need consolidation of the signals. Indeed, we need consolidation. The problem is that there are people who believe that 1, 2, 3, 6 people can generate all the genius ideas in this world. So we have to hear more ideas and better quality of these ideas, and maybe those who are in power will select something better. And we took them for them to make the decisions, not just the simple ones just because we like it, but because they are similar to those ones which can work out. Well, the picture for Ukrainians is quite obvious. And as for the opposition, well, His Majesty or our proposition of the president, it's way too far to be talking about something like that. And let's not be discussing what is happening inside our political circles. But I can say that it's narrowing of opportunities, not just for the partners, but also for Ukraine. And therefore, quite often they do it in this way because they understand that at the moment, the parliament, for example, or the other structures cannot have the impact which can be good for the negotiations. So we can say that the constitution is not the justification, and not only the parliament of but the martial law and that the president had the majority in the parliament. I'd like to remind you one fact which we are omitting all the time. During the Minsk agreements processes, our Western partners had the opinion that the government, which does not want to allow these things to happen, and we have to talk to the parliament, and we have to proceed, and then they will vote for the changes in the constitution which the Russians wanted. And I remember how the government gave the opportunity to French and German government to allow this to happen, and they came to discuss with all the fractions, not only with the leading ones. So everyone was there. Boyko was also there, and when they heard how they are not perceiving even on the level of just listening, not even just voting, they understood that probably it will not work out this way. So that is a small idea which we will have to vote for in the future. And we have to understand whether we have the ways, whether we are able to be thinking of it or not. And that is not just, taking away some right to make the decision. They just have to understand how they can do that, not just by the phone and like when you call, are you for or against territorial defense? And you called us with this number and we know your number. That is not the way how you define positioning. You have to give the opportunity for the people, even for the American guests, to introduce their thoughts. Well, I do understand that. And we understand all of it. And the president also said that Volodymyr Zelensky said that is a responsibility of the nation. The only problem is that, yes, you said it correct. The first thing is no sociological survey will not show you. The second one, that is something they rely on, the referendum and the decision of the parliament, because the parliament during the martial law is impossible. And second of all, there are lots of issues regarding the changes to the constitution in this case. And also, beside that, that is a long process. That's not something that can be done in half a year. There are 2 votes in the parliament of Ukraine, of maybe even 2 different parliaments. Yes, indeed. And from the point of view of legislation, I think that our partners all have underestimated. Only now they start to understand it and they start to state it, even in the U.S. Well, I can tell you that I'm always asking them the question. So you are talking to us and you're nodding that, yes, indeed, you will have to make difficult decisions. But in fact, are you ready to recognize when we will have to act not only against our constitution, but also against what you say the right? So how do you perceive the referendum in Ukraine when it is illegal? How can you recognize the elections if you will know for sure that they are not meeting the legislation? You will have to say, and it's not something that like OSCE typically says, that the principles in general, despite some issues, they were meeting the will of the nation. No, it will not work in this way. You have to recognize that the elections which will happen, the American administration, they have to understand whether it's realistic or not. If our partners will say that no, it's not realistic, in this case, the big tier of the task will be removed both for us and for them. Well, in fact, at least we have to explain that it takes a long time and we cannot, and the president cannot avoid it. And probably that is something that we can prove. And therefore, I can make the decision that the work has to be more intensive, because now we've heard that the negotiations regarding the other important, in fact, economical sovereignty of Ukraine, the negotiations are over, and there are some kind of agreed, approved draft of the agreement, of so-called agreement on the rare minerals, and that is the agreement on all the resources of Ukraine. It is over, and it is going to be signed. So it was going to be signed this week, and therefore, and after that, we will, so to say, will decide all these problems. Don't you think that it's kind of so that we can sign it with executive powers, and I will tell my opinion, because I think that according to the legislation on the international agreements, we have to have the president here, because there is a third article where it is said about the natural resources. But something is being signed, and our partners already consider it that it's something approved. And taking account the process which is ongoing, I think that it's similar. Don't you think that the same model will be used for the agreement Mr. Vitkov is discussing as an agreement on the territories? So they are talking about not about the tariffs, but about the territory. Don't you think that the risks which we discussed at the order here, well, you did it correct. The economical part of this agreement, which is very theoretical, the availability of some materials in our soils, which is economically beneficial to extract. And here I give you the example of the gas which we extracted in Ukraine, because there was an idea. The idea was quite the same, that our relations with the US, that we lack some economical component. And we have the interest, and the previous, every previous government is called to be corrupted, and in this way we do not, it's a kind of joke, but in this way we do not have to remember the names of the presidents and the ministers. But when we have 40, we have 3 billion, and it doesn't matter what is the amount of trade, and just compare with 2 billion of trade every day with Canada. And even though, despite this fact, they called Canada the 51st state and the president the girl. So, so if we forget about this economic component, which is already well understood, but bending over the knee and the pressure which is made when we forget the legal interest of the partners, so that is a reality which we have to keep in mind, and we have to be thinking, is this model worth applying, and will it be used during the next agreement? I can say that quite obviously the thing which happened in the White House, this scandal did not help us to score with Vance and Trump, but the fact that Zelensky stated clearly where are Ukrainian guarantees. While you do not like it, I do understand that, but nevertheless, we cannot see what do we get from it, how do we benefit. Our first task is to get the guarantees, the security guarantees, and they were pissed off because they knew about it. Well, you think that in this agreement, there can be some, yes, I'm quite sure the guarantees are not there. So what do we get? Well, it means that, in fact, painful and unpleasant but important discussion in the White House is now going down the sewage. Well, the Minister of Finance says that they are on the final stage, and I do believe in that, because most probably the project suggested by Ukrainian side is more acceptable, but nevertheless, I'm not going to speculate on that because we wanted not to discuss it. I do not agree that we shouldn't be discussing that, because we can have the situation when something will be signed, and you know that according to the Vienna Convention on the international treaties, that from the moment where something is signed, the president, the prime minister, the minister of foreign affairs are signing everything without mandate. Can you imagine this kind of situation? So you have the order of the president to sign this kind of agreement, and then you're showing to the nations through the parliament, of course, but the people are not approving it. Yes, we have this example. We have the zero version with the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union. I do not know, I know that you know, but still the only country which signed but did not ratify this agreement was Ukraine. When we talked about distribution of the assets and passives abroad. So our first government could not refuse from this agreement, but then they were not able to pursue just nothing comparing to what was discussed. So lots of political work, but none of the positions were approved. So getting rid of the connections with the Russian Federation, as Baltic countries did and most of the countries, or to recognize that the Russian Federation is our leader, hegemon, and they are calculating something themselves, and we will do whatever they say, as the other countries did. Well, in fact, let's be honest, officially, not the minister, not the president, not the parliament, no one agreed, and everyone wanted to disclose these assets, but they signed it. The prime minister signed, but the next ones, we know that for sure. They were sending the letters all the time, and that was always discussed with the Russian Federation. You have to show the assets. And we did not achieve nothing because the leverages of power were not enough, and then our Western partners waited, and the Paris Club of Creditors said that we were doing it in this way, and we do not recognize this the euro, and because it was not ratified. But as a fact, the fact is closed, and at least in this case, the Russian Federation, unlike the UN, they can say that they have inherited it from the Soviet Union. But there is a good example, the CIS countries. So when Ukraine did not ratify the statute, we were in the structures, and when it was not beneficial for Ukraine, we were not in these structures, and then we left. By the way, not all of the activities were suspended, but nevertheless, it's kind of a way closer to the national interests. I think that these kind of diplomatic maneuvers you're telling us are exhausting their resources. Well, the U.S. is our partners, and we should not be a kind of country which cannot be trading. Well, in fact, it was our survival strategy, because we are not the part of any kind of security guarantees, even though it sounds like a mock. We ideologically and historically we depended from the Russian Federation, and we had to separate ourselves, and we were maneuvering in our attempts to preserve the quintessence of this situation. And we do understand that the Minsk agreements were not the best, but that was still kind of maneuver. And we understood that those who work in diplomatic corps, we understood that we are protecting the interests of the state, because we understood that this opportunity will be over one day. And now we are in this kind of a situation. Well, the Minsk agreements will sound different, and we will see them differently after the Istanbul agreements, which luckily had no further steps. And well, by the way, that is a topic. The diplomatic approach, and second of all, that is, on the other hand, that is the perception of the partners. For example, we are talking with the U.S., and it's better to have the U.S. in the game than having them out of the game. And Donald Trump has already stated that it's not his word, that is a dangerous signal, and it's better to keep him in there. So let's switch to Canada, to the EU. So you mentioned Canada, and I was thinking about it in this way. Well, indeed, Canada and the U.S., these countries are next to each other as an example of fantastic coexistence. Not many mention the war between two of them, when not only Canadians, but also there were different divisions when they burned the White House. And the war was very tough between Canada and the U.S. But nevertheless, after that, they had co-dependence. Not only when it comes to economy, you remember those huge volumes which impress everyone of these interaction. And even nowadays, when we have these kind of statements, controversial statements regarding the 51st state, we do understand that Canada will never agree on these conditions. And by the way, even though it is weird, they are ready to be fighting for it if it's needed. But knowing the people in Canada, though the population is changing there and the policy is changing, but the statements are quite clear. But nevertheless, two countries, and quite often we were mentioning that there was a phrase, and I was mentioning that on our borders, unfortunately, the Russian Federation is. We border with not the the Russian Federation and not with Canada, or maybe it's better to say the U.S. Why? Even under such conditions of codependence, and well, the allies, and why, despite all of these, politicians leave these options for the future conflict. So that is the kind of specifics of the administration, or that is the specifics of the world, or maybe that is a new approach when big ones can have the right to get what they want, especially in places where they have the best relations. The Russian Federation did it this way. If we do not account the full-scale war, but the war in 2014, in fact, the nearest country was attacked, and they just decided to destroy it. Of course, there were some deeper reasons, but nevertheless, how come that it works this way? What is the problem? The neighbors, the closest countries are being destroyed, or these countries have to become the part of the bigger countries. I have to upset the audience. I think that is the logical and objective process. You mean the consumptions and expansion? Well, the readiness to play the game, readiness to keep in mind the possibility of aggression. So human nature, despite many various mechanisms, is still in place. I remember that in Canada, in the framework of the strategic support for Ukraine, there was an interesting program on asymmetric relations in the world, and they tried to teach us on their own experience how you have to. Yes, I participated in. Yeah, you're one of the participants of this program, and it sounds very funny. The Canada, which is in panics, and they do not know what to do with this neighbor, and they were teaching us, and they were explaining, you don't understand, we are explaining you. They had a very interesting comparison. They said that sleeping with elephant in one bed is safe and warm. The only thing is that you have to be careful when the elephant is turning in the bed. But I'd like to ask these teachers, so what now? So let's remember Mr. Ura Subtelny, historian who studied research to Ukrainian and Canadian history, who made the book History of Ukraine, and the program which actually, in fact, he developed for the state officials in Ukraine in the University of Toronto. And in fact, we had some interesting discussions and examples. I remember another thing, which in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Canada, you could have heard that time, and that is the report on the codependence between the U.S. and Canada, codependence. And it was not something sacred, and that is just for the internal usage at that time, and I'm remembering that time, not nowadays. 20% at that moment, 20% of Canadians had property, real estate property in the U.S., typically in the South, because it's cold and they were coming to Florida. And in the same way, a big number of Americans had property in Canada, and they still have it because they are coming to see the lake. So the codependence, economical codependence, is a very big one. So that's not something Donald Trump is mentioning, the plans, American plans in Canada. And it's not only about trade, it's kind of a combination of many things. But there is another thing about it. Canada did not allow America to get closer to their national identity. And they did it through the control over documentaries, through movies. So Hollywood had their share in all of it, but nevertheless, their identity was protected under the condition when they had so many different nations. And by the way, they use English language. And that is something that is an anchor nowadays, which does not allow politicians to be speaking of any kind of union. So how do you perceive, even under the war, so how important it is to have the national identity in Ukraine? Because the demands which we heard from the head of the State Security Service of the Russian Federation, Muryshkin stated the same things. So that is canceling the law on the language, on church, on communistic party. So something they call denationalization. Denazification, well, denazification is absolutely vague term, but nevertheless we understand that this list is sometimes mentioned. Well, what do you think about it? Can we be discussing this part of pressure of the Russian Federation, which they use against Americans, and they want Americans to use it against us. So something that has an impact on the national identity. I'm quite sure that they are going to make this kind of pressure. They will repeat it again and again, and sooner or later we will not discussing it. So we are talking about security, about shellings, about many other things, and at the same time we are making a pause for ourselves. But when we understand the systematic approach of the Russians and understanding that it's something written on the paper and that will appear sooner or later, and now we have to prepare our answers. So that is something we started with, the red lines. So the red lines, which in our opinion are the way for our survival. And if our nation is ready to survive under all of these ideological, so to say, pressure, and the fact that the Russian call our Nazism. So that is something that differentiates us. And in this way, we are explaining ourselves why we, even if some parts of Ukraine will be taken away, why we will remain Ukrainians. It's something unpleasant, but nevertheless, when we choose between choosing giving up some territories or remaining Ukraine with ideology, it's better to use ideology. Even the Polish, the country partially moved to another territory. So at the same time, they preserved the name Poland, Germany. They were divided and united. South Korea, they were divided, but they preserved this Korean identity. But if we will not have these grounds for Ukraine, someone will be living here, but we will not have this identity anymore. Well, I think this kind of idea is in many hearts in Ukraine at the moment. Maybe it sounds in a bit different way. We have to preserve Ukraine, and as for territories, well, in fact, if we are not able to do that right now, and here we have a division like that, maybe someday in diplomatic way, which is, in my opinion, absolutely impossible. But here is an interesting thing. You pushed me to this idea. Well, it's quite obvious that even without recognizing it legally, but just when we are saying that it's impossible to occupy all the territories, and of course there are people living there, and that is a tragedy for the people. And that is a case of Poland, which in 152 years they were under the Russian influence, and they were, during 152 years, 2/3 of this time, they were under Russian pressure since 19... And then it was destroyed and was divided. Poland was divided. And there was no Poland, but there were Polish people. And that is a tragedy for the people who were moving, living, coming, fleeing. We cannot imagine what people were feeling on the temporary occupied territories. When we are talking about territories, we forget that there are people living there, and some of them are still waiting for being deliberated, deoccupied. But there are the others, the youth, who are even now are the part of the Russian troops, and the ones who are taught now on who are their main enemies, except for Ukraine, NATO, and in fact Europe. And that is a new situation, and I think that our partners do not understand that so far, that in some period of time, if it will take more time, if we're talking about Poland or Baltic countries, there might be lots of Ukrainians there who will be with Russian passports at that moment. And that is a strength. That is a force which is much bigger considering our historical roots. So here we have two questions. The first one is, when you are talking with the partners, do they understand that there is a threat in case if we will have so sad peace? So there will be still a bigger even threat for them. And the second thing is that related to Europe, whether the membership of the European Union, whether it can be those kind of leverage to preserve Ukrainian identity controlled by Ukrainian government, so that in the future, together with the European Union, we could be speaking about some diplomatic future action. So that is the first question: how the partners understand this threat, because I hear 2030, 2040, but not 2026. And the second thing, the European Union not as a guarantee for security guarantee, but the guarantee for the identity, even despite the fact that it's a big number of nations united under one umbrella. So considering the fact that I'm not a diplomat now, I can say no to both of the questions. So I do not believe that our perspectives, European perspectives, is the strong factor for the people on the temporary occupied territories to believe that they can preserve Ukrainian identity. And this example is, and we can have Kaliningrad as an example. I can find no other explanations why these people. So you can see how you could have lived, and then you will be democratic, and the Russian Federation will be democratic. Yes, that is one side. I do understand that it's radical. Well, I'm talking about those Ukrainians, those Ukrainians who are now able, so who can be insisting on peace, identity without a part of their territories. So at the same time, they can not be approving all these conditions which change their identity. So this European umbrella, is it enough? Let me say in the other way. So the government has presented the draft law on education, and there we have the same, so to say, European conditions, pluralism and the others. So they are not fixing Ukrainian identity. They are making it more vague and not clear. Well, there are two typical nationalists, and the Russians are saying about people like us that we are nationalists. Well, in fact, the Russian war in Ukraine, during the war, unfortunately, some of the things like pluralism and the other ones, they have to be understood in different ways. So we are not strong enough to live in this broad consensus with all existing countries. And you remember those concepts, to forget about the wars in the south of Europe. Let's have all of them in NATO, in the EU. Let's dissolute these, and that is something that is not happening right now. And speaking of the first question, well, no, I do not think that Europeans think in this way. They do not understand that in the tanks. So I served in Chop in Sverdlovsk at the place where the tanks were crossing the road. And the general, there was a funny case, the general who had the Southern Corps, they said that they had to be elected. He had to be elected the deputy of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And there was a suggestion to reconstruct the war to Czechoslovakia. And they understood there will be lots of columns. The engineers looked at it and said, well, the road is so bad, let's do it the other way around, because this road was built in 1960s, and this road cannot be fixed, and the number of the tanks entering the country was extremely big, and that is the reason why the road was destroyed. And and I was explaining that were Ukrainians who were using these these roads, and they were nodding, but they did not believe me. And when we came to the situation where this aggression happened, the U.S. does not want to protect it, and the PT perspectives are becoming true. And I think that the U.S. will make a mistake. We are suffering so much, and I cannot understand how Europeans can think that they are still the threat for the Russian Federation due to the fact that we are suffering so much. Well, I do understand your opinion, and maybe I share it in many of the things, but let's speak realistically. Well, if we have the discussion and on the, so to say, temporary occupation of the territories of Ukraine, and when we decide to control and monitor, and the people who are going to monitor the situation are going to be the peacemakers, that is a discussion which was held recently. So then I have the question, why? That is not the peace enforcement, as it's written in one of the articles of the UN statute, in one of which actually it can be applied to Ukraine. When there is an attack on the country and the aggression is recognized, then peace enforcement and not peacekeeping and peacemaking. So let them be called peacemakers, even though the peacemakers are coming when there is no contradiction, when everything is under control. So why, so to say, how can we believe in these peacemakers after the war? And once again, what is discussed by the UK? So what I hear is that there are going to be troops with vehicles, 2 brigades. So what is the French president says? We can be calling them peacemakers, but nevertheless, can it give us some kind of realistic leverage for the negotiations? So if these troops, the contingent, the external contingent will enter, I'm not even talking about the territories and the lines, but just them entering Ukrainian territory, and how realistic it is, because all of us are hearing statements, but we don't see any kind of actions, and how applicable it is for this situation. Well, finally, I can say that everything that you've said is not only makes sense, but maybe it's not correct when we're talking about our partners. But we have to catch some on these to make them enforce it. So when Macron made the statements 1 year ago, why we did not send the members of the parliament, when we did not suggest the draft law on allowing the French troops to enter Ukraine? We do it all the time. We are doing that for some military exercises. I will tell you why. Because the Ukrainian government did not suggest it. Well, we continued. We are still the parliamentary presidential republic every day. So it's not forbidden. We were laughing, we dared to laugh at Macron because we said that he has Napoleon complexes, instead of saying that yes, indeed, tomorrow, and better to do it today. No, we were not laughing at them. And the Russian Federation they laughed at him. People were laughing at me when I said that there will be the critical cycle of this war. The UK will be the first one who will join it. People were laughing at me. So the UK will become not the first ones, but the second ones. And we know why the French will be the first one, because they have lots of troops who were thrown away from Africa. So we have to be smarter. We have to see the situation, the picture broader, and we have to use all the tools which are available. And also considering the fact that our bilateral documents are already allowing us to do that. That is our sovereign right, which President Macron stated. And maybe the UK, maybe they were not the first ones to form the the troops, but no, they are not the last one in promotion of this idea, even despite the fact that they have how many they didn't have many lots of troops, but I saw that there is one brigade, 5,000. They have expeditional brigade. They have, so to say, joint expeditional forces, which are controlled by the UK. The President Zelensky met them, and each time they had to be negotiating, and we knew that we have to be talking since the very beginning about the about expeditional forces. So we lost 3 years of the war when we were telling that we will be the part of NATO, which is obviously not happening. And instead of that, we had to form through diplomacy the coalition of the brave ones. And brave ones is probably not the correct interpretation, but nevertheless, well, now they are called the willing ones. So that are the journalists who named it in this way, or someone, but it's incorrect. But nevertheless, now they are called reassurance. Yes, that is written in the Budapest memorandum, because there are assurances, and here we have reassurance. That are not the guarantees. Okay, but nevertheless, in fact, you're absolutely correct. That is not true. That was not something stated politically, but that was said from the high tribunes. Moreover, and the normal process, according to UN process, when a few strong countries unite, after that they can be expanding their coalition, and that can be the UK, France, and Germany. Can you imagine the internal political sacrifices these people made, and what kind of agreements, what kind of risks did they undertake to make these statements? And we do not feel that the partner has already made, and we have to support them and to say that are the key partners. We have always dreamt to be like Macron, and that are our friends. And President Zelensky came right after the scandal in White House. Who did Zelensky rely on? These two nations, which luckily they start to become the third strong force, maybe the most strong, and then we will have more friends. We have friends. We have the north of Europe. Well, everything. The president of Ukraine was raising this question, and with a group of people in Nordic, they met Nordic, and the only thing we do not see some political actions, the statements or something that we want. For example, as you said, we want expeditional forces of the UK. So Scandinavian countries can join, all Nordic countries, 10 countries can join, and Baltic countries, yes, so to say, North Europe. So that is a mechanism which have to be in place. And we do understand that ceasefire, in the way how it is suggested by Donald Trump, is not something that will work out. And we do understand that we have to have the so-called peacemakers now. So what do you think? How, in this case, Ukraine has to treat China? Or in the other words, China as the player now, so considering the tariff war which is ongoing at the moment, considering the Ukraine publishing the information about participation of Chinese citizens with the flag of the Russian Federation, and that is a very sensitive issue, and it was critically perceived by China. Considering all of this, how we have to balance this game, and how do we use the situation with the U.S.? Because we said that geopolitically, Europe is not ideologically correct, but nevertheless, we do not. We still understand that the wars can be happening in the other places. Considering the fact that we are waiting for the next steps from China, what scenarios would be the most beneficial? Should we get closer with the current administration in the U.S.? And that is something we are doing at the moment. Or should we preserve the hope that China will change their opinion and will make it more balanced? Or should we expect that China will go further and will open the wave of Chinese citizens to participation of the war? We as taxpayers, we are taking care of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It is a small ministry, and we hope that they will suggest balanced policy, reasonable policy around the world, and let them do their work. That is a direct work, and so what about corporate solidarity? Well, corporate solidarity is that I feel the active, proactive part of diplomacy, which is ready to suggest solutions in China as well. I do not see that we have. I do not think that we will become friends tomorrow, and I do not see the alternatives of moving with NATO and EU. But I believe that we have intellectual capacity to work on this market and to manage more than China. We have India and the other countries. And for example, the US, so they say 85% of our economy is happening in this region. And let's think where we have to pay most of our intellectual attention. And therefore, Europe is doing what they have to do. And it's something painful for us. Maybe it's unfair, but that is a vision of our partner. And we have to respect it, at least to understand what they are taking account and not to be suggesting something wild. Well, to be fair, there is the new. With all my respect, the previous period was unsuccessful. We could not use this diplomatically, but we know for sure that China is not just a diplomacy. Well, it's very difficult. Nobody compares. Yes, it's a big country. And in fact, we have big problems even with access to the meetings. It's not us who created these problems. And the position of China is quite unreasonable. But what you said in the beginning about the region, Xi Jinping, when the leader of China who doesn't visit many countries, but as soon as there was the trading attack from the US, he went immediately or will go immediately around the Philippines, Indonesia, and the other countries. They are important countries for them, and our appointments in these areas, diplomatic ones, they are so to say, not residual. We understood the importance of this region, but nevertheless, in this region, for the diplomat working, having no tools in his hands, it's almost impossible. And I'd like to say a few words about our diplomacy. Because if something is bad, they say that diplomacy did not work well here. And sometimes when everything is working out well, typically it's about the official diplomacy. They call it diplomacy of board diplomacy, sports diplomacy, cultural diplomacy. I'm very conservative in this case because I think that diplomacy is the state service considering and the external policy. Well, there are lots of interesting methods. But nevertheless, the key thing is that it's the state service. It's not can be the diplomacy of the sportsman. No, it's just the image of the country. Anything but not diplomacy. So let's return to diplomacy. Now, one of the ministries, no, it's impossible to do everything with one ministry. So there we have the president, according to Article 106 of the Constitution of Ukraine, and quite often that is the government and other directions. And therefore, maybe we do not have the clear understanding that in this region, We mentioned also Australia, that in fact we have a so-called third line of defense of the US, where they will direct in the near future all their efforts. And Europe, well, they will make Europe be responsible of the security in Europe. That is obvious. And whatever people say that Donald Trump will be doing that and then everything will be over, and what? Well, I think that the perspectives of the U.S. are, so to say, more correct in the future. And now we come back to Europe. And you said that it's not that strong, but nevertheless, we have no choice. And let's be discussing, let's try to discuss the agreement of Ukraine with the nuclear countries of Europe. First of all, that is the UK and France. First of all, the UK, because we have an agreement, a big, serious agreement, 100th century agreement, but it's not finalized because, as far as I understand, the ratification has not happened, neither in Europe nor in France. Well, it's the decision of the government, which is accepted by the party. Well, there are two agreements with the same name, so that is kind of interesting way. Well, very British one. Well, I would say that in this case, the tango is danced by two. So we know how it was developing, and that's an interesting example, by the way. Not many people are discussing that. Two agreements with the same name. One requires ratification, and it's more kind of narrowed, and the second one does not, the expanded one does not need ratification. So, and the one which requires ratification, we need to ratify it now. So why the parliament is not working on this? Okay, then the second question. If they ratify it, so shouldn't we try be speaking about defense agreement with the UK? Well, that is something which we had to answer ourselves. If not, then what? A very unpleasant discussion. And but that what is interesting, quite often the countries which did not want to see it is not that they were saying that why do we need to discuss something bilateral? One day you will be in NATO, and the same people were voting about our against our us being in NATO, and now we can see the consequences. And if finally we will be told that you are not the member of NATO, and Trump wants to have it in the documents with Russia. In this case, we have no other option. And we should not be thinking how we can continue existing. Neutrality is not even funny. Saddam Hussein stated neutrality before the storm in the desert. By the way, let me use this opportunity. Professor Butkevich, one of the best experts on the international public law, not only in Ukraine, the former judge of the European Court, said that all our moves are listed there, and neutrality as the ideological position of the Russian Federation, KGB, it is identified here, because in 1990 they did not know what to do with Ukraine, and they decided to put it in a standby mode for Ukraine to write down neutrality. And this neutrality was mentioned in the declaration, and then it stopped. So that is a red line, in my opinion. Let me add, you know who was a key opponent of our neutrality during all this time? The Russian Federation. Because if we used to be neutral, they wouldn't have taken an action, because the neutral country cannot have the fleet. So you remember where did this neutrality came from? For this idea was used because the the warships cannot enter the port. So that was a good idea, but the thing it was not promoted, and they were fine with the Russian Federation was fine with it, and then they resulted in their own way. Now they occupied and annexed the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and now we can be neutral. Well, this topic occurred once again, and I can say that I would like to emphasize that all these analogies with Switzerland, with Austria, they are different, because that was even nowadays it's comfortable being neutral, being surrounded by NATO. And by the way, the Switzerland, the French has proved that the Switzerland is neutral. And when the war was ongoing, they just entered the Switzerland, and that's it. Well, in Belgium, they moved through 3 times across the border. Well, I can see that it's starts to occur once again from the same people who had, so to say, compromise position with the Russian Federation, but this period is over. Well, we have everything listed, and thank you very much for thank you for mentioning all of these. Well, in fact, we have discussed maybe not all of the questions, but nevertheless, I think that to expand them, we can suggest the questions from the audience. Hello, Petro Klima, the colonel of the headquarters. First of all, I'd like to thank Valeriy Chaly for inviting Vadym Prystaiko, who, as we know, is always giving us direct and clear evaluation in the international security issues. Considering the fact that I served in Kaliningrad, which was mentioned today, since 1988 to 1990, I know that people were expecting in 1995 that when the decision of a Potsdam agreement will be over and Kaliningradsk Oblast will return to Poland or to Germany. That is historical remark. And now the question to Mr. Vadym. We know, so to say, a philosopher, Lenin, who said that can you, from your experience, say, are there any kind of sense that our military leadership somehow delivers to our partners, to the coalition in Ramstein, the idea that the aggressor state, which during 34 last years is called the Russian Federation, has to be expelled, and also nuclear weapon, has to leave non-nuclear country Ukraine, as it happened with nuclear state the USSR, which left non-nuclear state Afghanistan, and they did it through the position of China. Thank you very much, and thank you for mentioning Kaliningrad. By the way, I have never had an opportunity to talk to the people who live in Kaliningrad. Even my mother and sister lived there since very old times. I didn't know that 1995 is something interesting for people, and it's important to remind it for those who think that Russians, that it's possible to prove something to Russians, to show the opportunity, and they have to choose the other option. If you show the showcase of the wealthy country, then the other always will return. That is something that people like discussing. As you have said, it is not. It is irrelevant because the Russian Federation does not want to give anything away. The idea that the Russian Federation has to leave, well, I think it's something on the level of the. It's a kind of dance performed by all Ukrainian delegation all the time, and that is not very beneficial, but nevertheless, that is a correct position for our partners. whether they like it or not, you have to hear that all the time, that we remind about the grounds, because it turns out that some do not understand clearly who started the war and how it is happening. But at the same time, I find the following explanation. Everyone understands it clearly. Everyone understands everything. The only thing is that as soon you believe in it and you trust in the next step, you have to make some decisions. And that is something that nobody wants to do. And therefore, the discussions are often not so deep that can lead to some actions. And our friends, the Ukrainian friends, they made a significant step to bring the troops, but nevertheless, now there is a question. These troops have to be in Ukraine. How can we do that? So I think that we have to enhance this work by enhancing their position, saying that you're right, and this is the method how we can be fighting a nuclear state and how we can finish this war. We should not give up as Ukraine and be in panics and feeling this kind of escalation as the previous American administration found, and it turned out that they did not give us enough for survive, and now we have the administration which is very radically not ready to give some solutions for us. So it can be done faster. Not always it's well perceived, and it has an impact on the dialogue, but we have to be doing that. I'd like to give the opportunity. We have chat, and people are watching and discussing something. Can someone read something, the question from the chat? Yes. Let's read at least one of them. One of them, I'm not going to name the Nika, you can read it, but nevertheless, referring to the post of Mr. Smosa, he's asking the following question. The algorithm of the action of Trump on freezing the war is similar to the U.S. leaving Afghanistan. Considering this, taking it into account, the question, what are the differences of our case? Well, I can say that the biggest fear for the U.S. administration is repeating the situation in Afghanistan, because we are mentioning these tragic things which, when the U.S. not only left Afghanistan, but they also left all their partners, for example, the U.K. So they said that we left together. No, they were surprised when they found out that now they have to get evacuated right now. That is, there are huge losses, and there are ideological and financial losses and military ones. And administration of both Biden and Trump, they do not want to repeat what has happened in Afghanistan. But nevertheless, unfortunately, the current administration has taken the easy way. Creating distance between Ukraine and this war, and they are not interacting with it. And in this way, they are not repeating the Afghanistan case. And we have to say that this time, you have invested in a very strong side in Ukrainians, with all respect to those agencies which wanted to leave the other way, and they saw the option. We are fighting. They are just helping. So, and I was always saying to the Americans, you should not be losing the investments you made in Ukraine. You invested in the right people. Continue doing that. And if we turn it this way and we explain that you do not need to leave this country, and because you even didn't enter it, you can help us to cover those shame, let's call it shame, how they love these people. And if they will understand it, well, the only thing I can tell is I can give you the case when I was working in the U.S. And at that time I was explaining that the operation in Afghanistan was working, and I had the opportunity to go as in the Navy troops to Afghanistan. So that is a painful experience. We lost lots of people in Afghanistan, unproportionately a lot of people. And I was telling Americans, do not go to Afghanistan. Use our negative experience, and we got a very interesting answer. Did you use the experience of France and the UK before that? And no, I said no, but someone has to remind that historically it's the country which does not consider itself a state, it's hard to achieve some success, and it's better to separate Afghanistan and what we have in Ukraine. In Ukraine, they can achieve a success, and they could not do that in Afghanistan. The only thing I would like to add, another interesting thing, there are some similarities, and the agreement of Donald Trump, who suggested the agreement on the rare minerals, the first thing, which ended with the work of some American companies, but nevertheless China entered the territory of Afghanistan. And the second one is Taliban did not fulfill all their promises. Taliban, I mean, like the Russian Federation in this case. Taliban did not fulfill all their promises. And the third thing, you mentioned it absolutely right. All these comparison, historical ones, they are very weak. If we compare it with Korea, there we have the other aspects and the other role of the U.S. there, and also Vietnam has another situation. But we have to be reminding our partners that there should be no decision of the military participation. With all our appreciation, we would like to thank all those who volunteered to support us in this war, but nevertheless, it's not enough to respond. And I think that if we are using the system, the international system, in this case, this international system should be working everywhere. And we did not refuse from it finally. Did Putin broke it, but it still exists, and therefore we do not have the troops of all of these countries, but we had these troops in Korea, in Afghanistan, and another conclusion that we can make. And if we had all these people, considering taking account your conclusion that we have much better situation, and if we had the international contingent, so the last conclusion, that Trump was concluding the agreement with Afghanistan, and all the arrows were aimed on Biden. And now it's the other way around. So political periods should not overlap with these kind of big issues. Politicians should not be thinking about tomorrow. They should be thinking of the future. Of course, that is something all of us want, not from outside, but also inside our country. So, concluding this interesting discussion, we covered lots of questions. I'd like to thank those who asked the questions, both online and offline. So I'm thinking, how should the end of our discussion look like? And well, I had a thought about some scenarios, about the possibility of 3 scenarios and how everything will be developing. Of course, there are the questions which everyone is asking, when everything will end. I'm not going to ask that, thank you. Could you tell us what you want to say to European audience? So what are the key recommendations you'd like to give our partners? Maybe not only the UK, France and Germany, maybe also Poland, which borders with us. So considering all we've discussed today, the key recommendations for the next month. Well, thank you for the great opportunity, because I was trying to when I was talking about investing in Ukraine and not to lose this investment, that is not just finances, but that is also political investments, because they had to lose their contacts with the Russian Federation. They lost all these flows of diamonds, of gold, and whatever they expected to get there, some culture, some whatever. They lost everything. And the second thing I'm always telling to my partners, in Ukraine, we are threatening Europeans that if you do not help us now, the Russians will destroy you soon. I think that is clear, but it's counterproductive, because we are telling them that they are not managing. Just do not get rid of your warehouses, because you will need it. Because we were the ones who were threatening that, and can make the decision to give up the weapons to Ukraine, the one which can undertake preventive measures. Moreover, I can tell them from the point of view mathematics, and generals are calculating this and that. They have a list, and that's not one person who makes the decision. That is a very deep policy. I'm always reminding them that thanks to your support, we have destroyed so many things that you have to recalculate all these expenditures and consider. Maybe considering this situation, maybe you can give us something more, because the Russian Federation is in the worst situation so far, and you are sharing the old weapons, which is 40, 50 years, and at the same time, they bought the nice toys they are preparing now. So there are two messages, and if each of us gave these two messages, I think that it would have been beneficial for us if these two messages were heard. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that our colleagues will hear us and do that in some certain cabinets, and we have the tools to enforce that. In the European countries, first of all, now we are talking about the European countries, and quite obviously that diagnosis or the conclusions are quite similar to what was stated, but I think that we've managed, with your help, to dive deeper, and we were able to consider these connections, relations. But on the other hand, your position is, so to say, realistic. It is not ideological, and quite obviously, because for decades you were working on this as a state official, and diplomatic work is a bit different. It disciplines you, and you understand what is achievable and what is not achievable. But with all these narratives which we hear from different sides, that Ukraine cannot continue doing something, that Ukraine will have to admit the situation. Well, in my opinion, it does not meet the current situation, because there are lots of scenarios, lots of changes which can happen, and lots of things can be surprising to us. The only thing I can say is that there is one thing which I'd like to mention, because, well, speaking of the recommendations, that is the recommendations for 2025, that after some certain period, we do not want what will happen after some certain period. Maybe that will be mobilization of the Russian Federation and in the entire mobilization, and that will be a very difficult scenario of a long war. Otherwise, it can be the enhancement of Ukrainian side, and we will achieve peace. And that can be also the decision without no solution. So lots of scenarios at the table, and the only thing is that, recapping, if you don't mind, three main aspects. The first thing is red lines, and they are clear for everyone, both in external and internal policy. The second thing is the necessity of participating directly of military intervention. And it doesn't matter who they protect, maybe in the joint training centers. So if you want to call them peacemakers, let them be peacemakers. And the third thing is that we can see that without enhancement of the leverage purchase on the Russian Federation, no plans, no ideas can be fulfilled. And what we've heard, so now we have ballistic missile attack, and unfortunately that happens every day. And first of all, it is happening on the territories which are close to the border: Sumska, Zaporizhska, Kharkivska, Luhanska, Donetska, Khersonska Oblast. But it is also the attempt to threaten Ukrainians, for the Ukrainians, both on the front lines and in the rear, to agree on the conditions suggested by the Russian Federation. So I think that this year we have to have the complex approach to this situation, and threatening Ukrainians is not something that will work out for the Russians. And the fact that we have big resources and that we invest in defense, well, I guess everyone understands that. And therefore, in my opinion, the recipe is clear. The only thing is that we have to understand how these mosaics, all these facts, make picture and how do we use it. And I do agree with you that without coordination of our efforts, it doesn't matter how efficient and creative officials, politicians are who have now these high positions. It doesn't matter that they have to consider themselves the most gifted, the most talented, and not to consider the opinion of the others. So today we've heard a lot of different information, and I think that we had a very constructive, detailed discussion, and therefore we hope that it's going to be useful not only for our external partners, but also for internal partners. Thank you very much for the participation. Thank you very much for attending Ukrainian Crisis Media Centers, and thank you for those who are online. Glory to Ukraine. Glory.